and in East Prussia, and they went back, and they did get it back. Because apparently there are laws in Germany, you know, that you can in the courts.
To repossess?
But it's all tied up with this was in the eastern, you know, around Königsberg, but that's all now a country that belongs to Latvia.
Okay, go ahead, hon.
Okay. Well, I'm going to just start by having you say your complete name and then spell
Okay.
it.
All right. You don't want Monny, just Manfred.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah, you could say both your formal
right.
name and your nickname. That's fine.
Okay, yeah. All right. My name is Manfred Wuerslin. It's Manfred Wuerslin. My nickname is Monny.
So we're going with Monty.
Okay.
And tell me, your unit served in World War II.
I was a staff sergeant in Company K, 85th Regiment, 10th Mountain Division. And I served in Italy. Went to Camp Hale in March of '43, and stayed in the outfit until I was wounded on the Po.
Now, can you tell me a little bit about how you came to be in the 10th?
I was going to school in Boston at Northeastern, and they let me finish out the first semester. I had joined the enlisted reserve, and I was given my papers in February, and in March I was inducted. One of the earliest numbers, I guess, in the enlisted reserve, we were ones, so I have a very low number in the, my Army number is a low number. And I had applied to join the 10th Mountain. I had 3 letters of recommendation from a mountain club, a skiing club, and a patron of mine, because I got a scholarship to Northeastern University.
Can you remember what your 3 letters of recommendation said?
No, I never did see them. But one was from a woman who had an office on Fifth Avenue, who was in the Appalachian Club. And she was in part responsible for my getting a scholarship. And she said she wrote a very strong letter for me. That's all I remember.
Did you feel like that the 10th was where you needed to be, or was it a good place?
Yes, I wanted very much to go into the ski troops. My brother tried to get me into the Air Corps because he joined the Air Corps, but I really wasn't interested in the Air Corps as much as mountain troops.
What was it about mountain troops that made you want to be a part of them?
I think the outdoor life. I had been skiing, and I loved the outdoors, and I just thought that rather than be a foot-slogging infantryman, I would prefer to be in the mountain troops, which is ironic because we wound up as foot-slogging infantrymen.
You know, I just happen to know that you weren't born in America. How about if you start with, just tell me briefly about where you were born and how you came to be here.
All right. I was born in Indonesia. My brother and I were both born in Indonesia because my father had a contract with the Dutch government to supply electrical equipment from Siemens in Germany. He was a German citizen. So that's how I happened to be born in Indonesia. We stayed there until 1925 when we moved back to Germany. And then in 1929, we emigrated to America.
Now, did you feel like a German citizen at any point of your life?
Well, not really, because we were separated as a family shortly after we got to America, and I lost my German. And then my brothers and I weren't really using German at all. We didn't hear German, we didn't speak German, and so I really became an American kid, about probably 6 or 7.
What was the reason that your family left Germany?
I really don't know the answer to that. My father, they said, always had sort of wayward feet. He had been in Southeast Asia, he had been in South America, and he was also in Indonesia as an engineer for Siemens. He was perhaps a very restless man. So he left the family behind when he traveled. We didn't travel with him, except in Indonesia, because there he was for a longer time.
I thought maybe there might be a political reason. But...
Well, you know, I never did really feel that there was a political reason for leaving. When my father came out of World War I, he was in Kiel, Germany, and that's where there was a rebellion by the soldiers, as you may know. Also, the city government was socialist. I think this bothered my father a lot, and he called them communists and wanted nothing to do with them. And as far as I'm aware, his views were probably upper bourgeois, aristocratic, rather than lower class working. And I think this is one of the reasons he left Germany. He just felt it was too chaotic. It was being taken over by revolutionary mobs. And about that time, which would be, I think, around 1923 or so, he started asking for overseas assignments.
Okay, so let's stop just a second. Honey, can you move a little closer to me? I just want to make a little adjustment here. We've changed a little bit. Okay.
Was that?
Yeah.
Let me just check my focus. Hang on here.
Well, his timing was good,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
But if you're asking whether, we left for political reasons, I really can't say that. Yeah.
Well, his timing was good regardless, wasn't
Very
it?
good. Yeah, I tell people I'm convinced because there are 4 brothers, and we all were in the United States Army and one in the Air Corps. I'm sure that if we had been in Hitler's Germany, we would have been lucky if one of us had survived. Because families with 4 sons who, were in the Army were decimated. Yeah.
Did you ever feel, while you were fighting against the Germans, did you ever have any internal conflict about?
Yes, I did, because ironically, my cousin was in the German mountain troops. And at the back of my mind was always the feeling that, perhaps I might be fighting against him. And I knew that. And, but it didn't raise within me any kind of effort to either delay my induction or to get out of service. I just felt, this was the way it was going, and perhaps I was not really thinking too much about those things in those days.
When you think about your early days at Hale, and can you tell me a little bit about your memories of training at Hale?
Well, I remember getting off getting off at the train at Hale, and almost from the beginning, I thought, this is God's country. This is going to be so great. And of course, there was a lot of training in the beginning, because I think unlike some of the other 10th Mountain people who had their 13 or 16-week training before they got to Hale, I had only 2 weeks at Camp Upton in New York, and then I was shipped out. So my early training, I think, was pretty much basic training, learning how to march, learning the weapons, learning what military life was about. I remember the Phi Ed classes that we had outdoors every morning, and I remember classes we had indoors for military training. Nothing more specific than that, though. I guess I was just feeling I was one of the troops, and I was doing what everybody else was doing.
Was it what you expected it to be?
I didn't really know what to expect. I think I probably had a more romantic view of what life in the ski troops would be like. And I think this was based on the European models, because I had heard of the mountain troops from the French, the Italians, and the Germans. In fact, one of my earliest memories was seeing a World War I movie. It was one of the few movies that, when we were still living at home, I was allowed to see. And it concerned Austrian and Italian troops fighting in the Dolomites, roughly in the same area that Hemingway wrote about in A Farewell to Arms. And it was about ski troops. It was about mountain troops. And I remember that in the scenario, I think the Austrian troops were digging to blow up some Italian troops that were in a stronghold on the mountain. And I remember that they were skiing in it. And I thought this was all very romantic and very daring.
Well, when it turned out, was it very romantic and daring?
Well, yes and no, because I think the training at Camp Hale was, you know, for me as an outdoor person, everything I could have hoped. You know, we went out and, into the forest on weekends. We took hikes. I mean, all of that. We went fishing in the streams. All of that was just, I mean, it was all great outdoor living, and that was just wonderful.
And what would you say would be the parts that were not quite so wonderful?
Well, I can't really, until we got into Camp Swift, I really can't say it was all that bad. I mean, I know that D series was terrible in a lot of ways, but it was part of the whole mountain, you know, mystique. Whereas when we got down to Camp Hale, it was hot, you know, sand and flies, and we didn't have our equipment, and we were wondering if we were going to end up, you know, as flatland soldiers somewhere.
During D series, did you have a sense that this was something that was going to be important?
Yeah, I thought we were training for mountain warfare in Norway or someplace like that, you know, and so we took it seriously because we thought we were going to need all our experience to survive.
What was D series like for you?
Well, it was very cold. I remember that. I remember the night it got down to about 30 below, and we took our boots inside a sleeping bag. We were sleeping outside. We weren't sleeping in tents, at least in my squad. And it was very cold. I remember praying to myself, if I ever, you know, survive this, I'll never complain about the cold again.
Did you ever have any question in your mind that you would or wouldn't survive it?
Not really. Even on Belvedere, there was just not any thought that I wouldn't survive. I don't know what gave us this feeling, but I guess unless a soldier has that, you know, he's not very effective in combat.
What would you say got you through some of those more difficult parts?
Probably the fact that I felt that my comrades were very well trained, that we had good equipment, and that we could depend on the units to get us through the thing.
When you think back to your training at Hale, what would you say was your favorite part of the training?
Probably Cooper Hill, because it involved skiing, and there wasn't as much GI stuff there. In other words, we still had roll call, and we still did duties, but I don't remember any guard duty. I don't remember any onerous, you know, work like that. We lived in barracks, and we spent a lot of the time skiing, training, and we had free time to ski, and that just sounded like, you know, a wonderful world.
Now, when you got over to Italy, tell me a little bit about what your duties entailed, for starters.
Well, we landed in Naples and took an LST up to Leghorn. Then we were trucked to our staging area. I don't remember what it was, but we ended up in I think a town of Prunetta, which was up in the mountains. And we had taken over some buildings in the village, which was a small village. And at that point, we simply were occupying the village, and we were waiting, you know, for orders. This would have been, I guess, February, because we were on the SS America in January 4th, I think is when somewhere in January, and so we were in the lines by February. And I don't remember much that we did in the village. I went on one patrol, which was not on skis, and other than that, we were sort of sitting quiet in what were, I suppose, villages behind where the lines were. I didn't really have a great sense of the total picture. For me, it was always pretty much the 4th Platoon of Company K of the 85th Regiment, and what we were doing was what more or less, you know, kept me interested.
Did you know where you were?
Only that we were in the mountains in Italy. I remember that we had been through Luka, And I had some sense where Luka was. And I knew that Bologna was still in enemy hands, that Florence was in our hands, and that we were somewhere along the Apennine line between Bologna and Florence and Leghorn.
Did you have a good sense of what you were facing?
No, I had no sense of that, except that we thought it would be a very rough campaign because the Germans had the top of the mountains. Yeah.
Now, knowing that they had the top of the mountains, in the back of your mind, were you thinking there was a pretty good chance of success or not?
I don't know that I ever thought about that. I mean, I sort of left those things to the higher-ups. I was hoping that they knew what they were doing, I suppose. But I didn't really think too much about the future. And I wasn't sure what, in fact, was going to happen, whether the thing in Europe would end, in France before we even made a push. It was, as you know, late in '45. And I suppose we were hoping it might be over in France first, so that we wouldn't be doing any fighting. But I'm just guessing. I really don't know what my feelings or thoughts were about that.
Were you hoping that you would have some chance to fight, even as much as you perhaps wanted the war to be over? Were you hoping that?
No, I can't really say that I was hoping to fight. I was there, and I'm sure we were all thinking that if the orders came, we would go, and if the orders didn't come, we wouldn't go.
When the whole action started with Riva and Belvedere, can you tell me a little bit about where you were and what you were doing?
Again, I don't have a great sense of the bigger picture, except our company was part of the 3rd Battalion. We were in reserve, I think, at first. And on the night that we were ordered to move, we were going up Belvedere. I think the 87th was on our right. And we left, we were in cover. We weren't allowed to be outside. I remember that. And then the orders came to move up, and it was dark. It was at night, and we started moving up the mountains. And I don't have any clear sense of what other people were doing. I was following. I think we were wearing a little white patch on the back of the helmet so we could see the guy in front of us. And we were following the guy ahead of us, is basically what we're doing. I remember at one point there were explosions and there were cries for medic, and we just kept moving up. I think we left around 11 or 12 at night, and we got up there around 5 o'clock. The sun was just coming up, and there had been fighting, but my squad wasn't in it. I was in the machine gun section. And we weren't ordered to provide fire for anyone. We were just moving up to occupy the mountain. And when we got up there, of course, there had been fighting already. A good friend of mine in a different platoon, in a rifle platoon, had been killed. We learned about that. And I remember the dawn was just coming up, and we were told that we were going to get air support. And that made us just glad as hell. And then the planes did come, and we could see them in the brightening sky, and they did drop bombs. And I remember also going over the top of the hill to German bunkers on the other side. And they had a strange smell to them, because soldiers obviously had been living there for a long time, probably several months. There were things scattered on the floor. They had bunks. There were blankets. I remember there was some hardtack, which we took, this German hardtack. And I got a knife and a fork from a German mess kit. I remember that. And then we were told to get out of there because by then I think the Germans were getting ready to shell the backside of Belvedere, and we moved back again.
You moved back, and then how did you eventually progress?
I don't remember when we, all got together again and started moving. I do remember that we were on the top, and we were ordered to move down through a saddle and I think up another mountain. I'm not sure. which I think we occupied that night because we were dug in that night in, I think they were German foxholes, because that's where I saw my first dead German. It wasn't on Belvedere. It was after we had moved off and started attacking along the ridge, I think. But again, I'm not even sure of the geography there.
Was it very chaotic?
Well, no, I can't say that it was, because after we had occupied the top of the mountain, we were just, we were told, well, this unit stays there and that unit stays there, and just wait for orders. Yeah.
What was the next bit of action that you can recall after that?
Well, I don't know where the other units were anymore, and I remember occupying a part of a hill. Now, I don't think it was the top of Belvedere anymore. By then, I think we had moved off, because we had moved down and up, and it was the next night. I remember it was very cold that night, and we were sleeping out in foxholes. And I guess the only other thing I remember was the next morning they had already moved up some Red Cross units or people, because that was the first time I had seen them. They must have been very close to the line. By then, I suppose they had moved the wounded off, and the various companies were occupying various parts of the terrain. But I couldn't tell you what mountain it was, or what our next objective was, or whether we were in reserve, or whether we were spearheading anything. This is the 3rd Battalion now of the 85th.
As they moved progressively down the mountain chains, like Della Torracia, did you ever have a sense of where you were
No.
in those battles?
The names Della Torracia and Gorgolesco, they really don't mean much to me, because I don't think I knew at that point where we were.
Well, when you think about that whole sequence of battles in there, can you think of something that really stands out to you?
Well, obviously, once that objective was taken, there were others that had to be taken along with them. I don't know what the 87th and the 86th were doing, but I do remember that we occupied one ridgetop where we were getting fire from our own troops. And we could look, and we were in the woods, and I think there was some short fall rounds, because they exploded in the woods, and they were hitting. Now, it may have been German fire, but I had heard that it was friendly fire. And I remember looking over the ridge, and we were looking down on German held territory. That was really the first view I had of German held territory. And I also remember that there was a man down there, and he was walking in plain view, and he was issuing orders to someone. It must have been about a mile or two off. And we occupied that piece of terrain for, I think, a day and a night. Now, things get very chaotic for me at this point, because I don't know whether we were in reserve or whether we were spearheading anything. But the first couple of days, the first 3 days, I remember the attack up Belvedere. I remember moving off Belvedere and occupying a piece of terrain where we slept in foxholes on a very cold night. And I remember the next day when we occupied this other hill where there was this fire coming down through the trees, because we were in the woods. And I think after that, which would be 2 or 3 days, we were sort of, either we were in reserve or things had quieted down, because I think that's where my memory of any actual fighting sort of stops.
How about fighting after that?
After that, I don't really remember much fighting until April. Oh, yeah, there was another day I remember. And that, of course, is Hill, I guess it must be Hill 913. Yeah, I remember that. several days in which we made those attacks because we lost quite a few people. And I remember a good friend of mine sitting next to a stone wall. He had been shot in the buttocks, and we were running by. We couldn't stop, but we were all saying, "Well, you're out of it now." And I remember that scene very vividly. But this was the fighting for Hill 913, which was, I think, the most intensive fighting that we were in, even counting Belvedere. That is my machine gun section. Yeah.
What happened to your machine gun section on Hill 913?
Well, all I remember was that we were sitting sort of on a side of a hill watching the infantry advance, and we had to run down the hill, across the fields, and up the next hill. And I think that was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because we had to go so far, and the effort was just so terrible. I don't remember shelling, and I don't remember whether people were being killed, but I remember we were stopped because apparently either our company or another company was unsuccessful in getting to its objective. So either they regrouped, or more companies or something were called in to the fighting. What I know about 913, if I'm remembering exactly whether it was 9/11 or 9/13, was that it was a very hard objective to obtain, and that the Germans put up very stiff resistance there.
When you think about what you found so difficult when you were running across the field, can you think specifically about what made it such a tremendous effort?
Well, just being so tired and being scared, I suppose, because there was shelling coming down into the area where we had to run.
What sort of things did you have to carry as you were running?
Well, I was not carrying any equipment except my M4, my rifle. I was not issued a carbine. I still had a rifle. I think, in fact, you were given a choice whether you wanted a carbine or a rifle, and some of us preferred a rifle because we thought it shot farther than the carbine. But I was not carrying a machine gun. I mean, the machine guns were broken down into the barrel and the tripod and the ammo, and my squad were carrying those.
Tell me a little bit about what your specific duties were within the squad.
Well, it was primarily to provide covering fire, which meant that if possible, we would try to get to the sides so we could provide enfilading fire from the sides. And we did that we did that in that action. I don't remember ever having to do it after that, even in April when we were attacking through the Po Valley, through the last hills before the Po Valley.
Tell me a little bit about what you remember about the April offensive.
Well, I remember that we were in reserve. That is, we were not... Oh, between this time, we all got leave. And I remember we went to a town called Monny, and we were there for a week after the Belvedere action and before the April action. And that was wonderful because it was a spa town, and they had these baths, and we had occupied a hotel, and we could go drinking in the afternoon because there were bars that were open, and we could go sightseeing. We also, that was in Monte. That was very pleasant. And between the two actions, the April and the February action, we retrained and we got rest. We got fresh clothing. We had showers. We had good food, good hot food. And then the April action started, I think around the 13th or 14th, because I remember I was washing my socks when I heard that President Roosevelt had died. And I think it was around that same time that we started the April offensive. And about that, I don't remember very much except that we were always marching. We were marching and fighting. But I don't remember any specific fights that I was in that action. But I remember doing a lot of we were on the sort of the ridges of the hills. We weren't down below where the roads were. And we were marching 10, 12, 14 hours a day. And I remember it was very, very tough going. I remember one town we stopped in, we occupied the policeman's barracks. And I remember when we got down off the mountains into the Po Valley. And then things changed very much. We were in trucks part of the time. We saw a lot of Germans. Most of the action seemed to be from tanks and, you know, bigger units than ours. And until we got to San Benedetto Po on the Po River, I don't remember any other fights that personally we were in, or that my squad was providing any kind of cover fire.
Did you have a sense that you were making tremendous progress?
Yes, because there one or two times I think we were trucked, but most of the time we were marching, and we knew we were making progress because we had to keep walking so much. We didn't stop. We didn't stop in the villages. The people came out, but we went right through and we kept going. We did not rest or stop anywhere until we got right to the river. Yeah, and at the river, they were trying to cross. The bridges had been blown. We were dug in along the side of the river, and the Germans started laying down 88 fire. And that was when I was wounded, and that was where the war ended for me.
What happened right before you were wounded? What led up to you?
Well, I think we were digging foxholes because fire began to come in. They were getting ready to cross. In fact, maybe some had already crossed, but we were still behind. There were dikes on both sides of the river, and we were on, I guess, the southern side because we were moving north, and we were told to dig our foxholes and wait to cross the river because they had to bring up boats. And we were doing that when the Germans started laying down fire, and I got hit on the side of the head. All I remember that things got very red, and I felt like I was going through the air, and the next time I woke up, I was in a field hospital.
How much time had passed between?
I think a day and a night, yeah. I remember I was on a gurney, and the doctor was saying, "Can you see my fingers?" because I was wounded on the side of the head. And I remember that, and that's the only thing I remember of that day or night. And then the next thing I remember, I was on a train being taken back to Leghorn.
When you think about the time that you spent in the 10th, did you have any sense that it was a defining period of your life?
Well, sure it was defining because we felt we were engaged in a huge action that we were a part of, and for me personally, as a young man, that I had been through it and survived it was, of course, for me a very meaningful thing.
How do you think it shaped your life?
It probably made me more pacific than I had been before. I think it changed my view about war very much. I still have that feeling, you know, that it would be better if we didn't have to go to war. And I still have the feeling that wars can be negotiated around more than they need to be fought. So it didn't turn me into a pacifist, but it certainly gave me the sense that there must be better ways to solve the world's problem than this.
When you think about the time you spent in the 10th, can you think of ways that might have shaped you in other ways that helped you prosper after the war?
Well, I think the culture of Italy really affected me because I took my leaves in Florence. After I was wounded and got out of the hospital, we were given leave, and I went to Florence, and I was very interested in the art of Florence. And I've been back to Florence a number of times. The whole culture of Italy, I think, attracted me very much. I think it determined, in one sense, my future profession, because I didn't go back to engineering, which was what I started in, but I went into the humanities. And I'm still very much interested in art and literature and cultural things of that nature, rather than perhaps the more industrial side of life.
If you had to sort of quantify the spirit of the 10th, could you think of how you might describe the spirit of the 10th Mountain Division?
Well, I think what tied us together was a love for the outdoors, for the mountains, for the difficulty of being in an environment that challenged you, and for the kind of people, I guess. I just felt that the people I was with were the kind of people that were the best in the world, and I wanted to be with them, and I wanted to be with them then and in the future, and somehow that spirit of the outdoors and the mountains and all that meant to us would continue in the future. I've been a lover of mountains and the outdoors and skiing and hiking ever since, and I think that certainly was a defining part of my life.
Can you think of anything that you'll wish later? Oh, I wish I had said this or that, or
wish I had
said. Can you think of anything we didn't talk about that you'll wish that we had included?
No, I think you've done a pretty good job covering it. I hope I haven't spoken too much, or out of turn. And I suppose we're off now, but I suppose other people will say, Monny, that wasn't the way it happened at all. And this is one sense I have very deeply about war, is that you really know very little about what's going on. And the memories you have of it are very treacherous. There's a very famous American writer who, in a speech at Princeton, said, anything produced by memory is fiction. Now think about that. Anything produced by memory is fiction, which means that a lot of the things we're saying 60 years later may in fact not be exactly the way it was.
Did you take letters, or did you write many letters or diaries?
Yes, I did write letters. I wrote letters to my brothers. They were all in the Army. I wrote letters back to Lucy Temple, who was one of those who wrote a letter of recommendation for me. I remember writing a letter to Lucy when we were in April, just before we did the April offensive, and the cherry trees were out. And I quoted Hausman's poem to her because we were kindred spirits, this woman. She was in the Appalachian Mountain Club, and she liked hiking, and I liked it, and she was humanely educated, and I liked that very much. And I remember writing a letter to Lucy talking about how beautiful it was on the top of the mountain. I could see the cherry trees, and that life at that moment was just very good. I wrote letters back to my father, but unfortunately those letters were lost. And I wrote some letters back to my brother, but my brothers never kept my letters. So I have no visual record of what I was saying or thinking. It's all memory, and I distrust that quite a bit.
Did you ever think about the contrast between how beautiful it was with the cherry blossoms coming out and the fact that you were in the middle of this war, which was...
Yeah, I think all of us felt as we went through ruined towns, that we were part of the destruction of what was going on in Italy. I certainly felt that because we saw a lot of ruins, and there must have been Italians who were told to leave their homes because we had to occupy them. In the Prunetta, the little village that we were in, it was only one company, but we occupied most of the village. And I don't know where the natives were going. They didn't spit at us. They were very good to us, and I think they realized that we were there to help them. But it must have occurred to us that it must be very tough on the Italian natives, especially in the mountains where we were, in the winter, that what we were doing was affecting them.
Did you ever think that your time in the 10th would have such a big impact at the time? Did you ever have a sense that it would impact you?
No, I didn't really. I must say, I didn't have a great many thoughts about the future. All I knew was I wanted to get back to college. That was my major goal, I would say, to stay alive and finish my college education. I didn't know what was coming after that, but as far as a goal, that was my most immediate goal. Yeah, and I did that when I got out of the hospital. Yeah.
1 minute on the tape.
Oh, okay. Did you feel like that you were lucky to get through the whole experience?
Yes, I did, because Bill Edwards, a good buddy of mine, was killed on Belvedere, and we had a lot of good times in Camp Hale and also in Camp Swift. His wife came down, I remember, driving a blue convertible, and so Bill and the rest of us in our squad went to the towns around Swift, and we had a good time. And I remember thinking, well, it's going to be different for Bill's wife now. They just had a child, and that affected me a great deal. I went back to see her after the war, after I got out of the hospital, and I saw the baby, and and it makes you think about how lucky you were to survive.
The end?
Yeah, I guess it's the end when you